Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by University of Illinois Extension and Rural Partners, the Illinois Rural Development Council. I'm Nancy Woodralgo, CED Specialist at U of I Extension. I wanted to mention that our program leader, Ann Silvis, serves on the board of directors for Rural Partners, and she usually introduces Laura, who is Director of Telehealth Services at SIU School of Medicine, and also serving as Chair of the Board of Directors for Rural Partners. I want to let everybody know that they should put questions or comments in the chat space at any time during the presentation. If you have anything that comes to mind while they're speaking, while the presenters are speaking, don't hesitate to put that in there. Those questions are going to be curated, proposed to the presenters at the end of the webinar. Thanks again, Laura. I'll hand it over to you, and be sure to let everyone know in the chat as well today that they'll be receiving slides and a recording after the session. So thanks again, Laura, and I'll pass it over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Nancy, and thanks to Extension for partnering with Rural Partners to offer these webinar sessions. So good afternoon, everyone. Again, Laura Hepkessel with SIU School of Medicine and serving as Chair of Rural Partners in this role. Nancy's gone through most of the housekeeping things. Just quickly, in case you're not familiar with Rural Partners, we are not-for-profit. We're the state's Rural Development Council. We're a volunteer board, membership driven. We encourage folks to get involved and join Rural Partners as a member. I will include a link in the chat box so that you can learn more if you're interested, and please reach out if you would like to chat. So today we're going to hear from our great panelists about adapting to the new working environment in rural Illinois. We have three presenters. Cheyanne Geidman is the engagement specialist with the Purdue Center for Regional Development, and Carrie McKillip and Russell Medley are both community and economic development educators with University of Illinois Extension. I've had the great honor of working with Carrie and Russell in the past, and Cheyanne is wonderful as well. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about what they have to talk about today. And I'm going to pass it on to them. Please don't forget, if you have questions, please enter those into the chat box, and we will get to those at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. We'll go ahead and get started, and I am Carrie McKillip, and I am currently in West Central Illinois, and so I'm working remotely. So this is a good topic for us to really dive into today. So talking about being remote and ready and how rural communities can actually think about using remote workforce as an attraction, or remote work as both an attraction strategy and an economic development strategy within their communities. One of the reasons that we're talking about this today is, and I think I can speak for a lot of us, that many of us did not have remote work on our radar as something to be a top priority prior to March of 2020. And even though it really has been a growing sector of our workforce for the last 10 to 20 years, and we would hear people talk about digital nomads, and we kind of, oh, those are those young alien creatures that we don't really find in rural Illinois, right? They're over in Thailand or some really exotic, exciting place like that. Well, for better or worse, we all sort of modified our DNA over the last 15 months that we're all now a little bit of digital nomads ourselves. And so really thinking, how do we capitalize, and how have we really changed the face of the workforce, and what does this mean moving beyond 2020? For a lot of us, and I call myself the experienced generation right now, we're really surprised to find that remote working really does work well for us, and the fact that people all across the age and generation spectrum have really embraced it to some extent really is making a real impact on our workforce both in the urban areas and for us in rural areas as well. For a lot of people, this rests in lifestyle changes and choices that can be made when you have the flexibility of working in different environments. So there are really three major questions that you want to think about in terms of using remote work as an economic development strategy or investigating the potential for it. There's not a lot of in-depth research over what has happened in the last 2 years yet, simply because we just haven't had time. We do know that lots of the workforce have really embraced this, and there are some estimates that say that up to 40% of the workforce may remain at least partially remote moving forward, which is an enormous percentage compared to where we were prior to the pandemic. So the questions that we talk about or think about is the where, why, and how of how decision makers can think about investing in a remote worker attraction strategy. So thinking about where would that remote worker be more viable as an economic development strategy? Why would a community or region choose to initiate a remote worker strategy? And then finally, how would a community develop and implement a remote worker attraction strategy in terms of the nuts and bolts of what that kind of a strategy would look like? So I'm going to start a little bit with where, before I turn it over to Russell to talk about the real in-depth nuts and bolts of this. But according to the Business Insider, 41% of remote workers never want to go back to the office. And that is even up from the beginning of the pandemic, up from 29% in January of this year. We really don't have a feel. Some of that is just the change of lifestyle that I mentioned previously. And some of it is people have recognized that their productivity has gone up as well. When we talk about where, where is a function of where those remote workers are now, but also what makes sense for people. For instance, are you a remote worker who never ever has to go in the office? Then where is anywhere? Are you a remote worker that needs to go to the office once a month? Then you're looking at a different set of dynamics. Or are you a remote worker who may do a hybrid model where you have to go to the office once or twice a week or so? Then the where becomes a little more fixed. But in a larger sense, almost any type of community can invest and look towards a remote worker attraction strategy, as well as a strategy to think about remote work as a viable economic development option for their community. So there was really no barrier in terms of geography. There may be some barriers that we'll get into in depth. Both Russell and Cheyanne will talk a little bit more about this, but is the broadband infrastructure in place? The odds of you doing a successful remote work strategy are going to be very slim if you don't have the broadband infrastructure. Can remote workers have a reliable connectivity? And are there a co-working space? Co-working spaces are just a place where remote workers can get together. There's some dynamics involved when you can have co-working spaces for those who need them. Are you positioned on a transportation route? If you have to, four-wheel drive out of your location, that may not be the best. But there's all kinds of questions, the natural and built attractions, who would want to live there. And not every community has the broadband or amenities to attempt a remote worker attraction strategy. But you may be surprised if you were to do a survey of how many remote workers are already living and working in your community. Often we don't see them because we're not looking. So the key may be to figure out why they're there in the first place And that can be your first step in deciding if where you're at is a good, viable remote worker strategy. So I'm going to turn it over to Russell now.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. My name is Russell Medley. I'm Community Economic Development Educator, and I'm in the Quad Cities region, which encompasses the counties of Rock Island, Henry, Mercer, and Stark counties. And I'm going to kind of talk to you about why would you want to have a focus on remote work as an economic development strategy. And to start off, remote work has been around for a while. This is not new. In fact, between the years 2007, 2017, remote work job opportunities in communities had grew by about 115%. So we already knew this was a potential strategy then, but of course, COVID kind of kicked it into high gear. So generally, why would you want to consider a remote work strategy? So this is more at the top level, federal level, national level. Why would you want to do it? So rural unemployment or underemployment rates are much higher in urban, in rural underemployment rates are much higher than in urban areas. So the traditional industries that we have in our area, in rural areas, agriculture, manufacturing, are facing automation pressures, and those trends tend to undercut job growth. This has also produced a very strong migration out of rural areas into urban and suburban areas. Overall, because of that, overall economic growth in rural areas continues to lag urban and suburban areas where investment is taking place. Current economic development strategies that are really focused on business attraction, business recruitment, are proven to be too costly, especially if you have an incentive deals and they're not properly written. They are proving, and a lot of economic developers are seeing this, and are proving they are ineffective at adding jobs to local economies and are strapping local economies with their budgets. Another reason why you want to consider it, broadband access is expanding across the United States and in more rural areas. It's growing faster. It's a key infrastructure that is absolutely necessary for remote work. According to Upwork survey, a survey that was done in February 2021, 14 to 23 million Americans are planning to move, and they are looking for more inexpensive housing. Does not necessarily mean they want to all move to the rural areas, but they may be moving to suburban areas, but there's a large group of the American population that is looking to make a move in the next few years. And according to Bureau of Labor Statistics, about 29% of workers, or 42 million workers in the United States, have the ability to work from home. And this kind of fluctuates between 25% to 33% who can work remotely. So there's a huge number of people who can actually, who are in that pool that can be attracted to other communities to live there because they can work remotely. What has really changed now from prior to the prior years, early from 2010 on, was we had a pandemic that forced us to really take on remote working. Millions of people had to work remotely for the first time ever, and a lot of businesses were very reticent about doing that. It was a grand experiment, and a lot of the companies found it actually worked. So prior to the pandemic, only 3% of the population, the working population, is working remotely. During the pandemic, about 30 to 40% were working remotely. So we've already seen a number of states start experimenting with developing remote work strategies, and they're focused on attracting remote workers to their communities, as well as focused on training existing residents in their communities for remote work opportunities. However, we need to keep it in perspective that this strategy is so new. There's not a lot of research out there. A lot of the research is anecdotal, so we don't know the transformational potential for remote work as of yet. A lot of people are looking at it. A lot of universities, think tanks are are trying to crunch those numbers. So we'll probably have more information soon. So let's see. But getting down to Illinois, for rural communities in Illinois, there's several reasons that we'd want in Illinois to explore remote working strategies for our communities. Obviously, it's a lower cost alternative to existing attraction programs that we currently have as economic development strategies. You will have costs for remote worker strategies, but and depending on how you structure it, you might have to market to targeted communities or have targeted incentives or co-working spaces, but it will not cost as much per job as that of incentives required to move a whole business to the community. It's also a lower cost approach for companies who are looking to access new pockets of labor without the expense of facility relocation. Adding remote working as a strategy diversifies your existing economic development strategies and can be an important part of expanding your local entrepreneurship and job creation. It attracts new talent to rural communities, and this is the #1 goal of economic developers, but it traditionally requires expensive investments in cities' infrastructure first. With remote work, you can entice the employers without having to convince an entire company to relocate. It can also help retain your existing residents and attract former residents back to the community. If you are doing a remote worker strategy, you will not only want to reach out to and market to people to bring their remote jobs to your community, but you're also going to want to connect your residents to available remote work job opportunities that exist. And there's a number of organizations that are out there compiling these lists of remote work job opportunities and training opportunities as well. It can expand the technology and digital prowess of your local workforce and provide employment opportunities for a large base of your population, new high school grads, new college grads, trailing spouses, the chronically underemployed or unemployed, disabled population, and even retirees. And a focus on remote work helps your community withstand, or helps your community with economic resiliency, and it helps you withstand economic shocks. I think all of us know that a lot of rural communities have one major employer or two major employers, and if something happens to that employer, that's major repercussions on the community. So this has the ability to expand your economic base in your community. So Carrie, next slide, please. So how would you do it? How do you do this? And I'm not going to give you a prescription, an actual program, but some steps you might want to look at. So I think we've already mentioned that your remote worker strategy can include an attraction component where you're trying to bring people in from outside with their jobs, their buying power, and get them to live in your community, but also to expand opportunities for your existing residents to participate in or take on remote work so they can stay within the community. So how do you begin focusing your strategy? Well, obviously, #1, assess your level of broadband access. High-speed internet is going to be your #1 priority to beginning to attract remote or virtual workers. And you'll have to invest in broadband infrastructure. And just so you know, you might be sitting there saying, well, we don't have that great of an access to broadband. We don't have the, it's not that great right now. I think that remote working is probably going to be, it's not just a trend, it's going to keep going. It's a long-term trend because it's a low-cost alternative for both communities in economic development, but also for businesses. So you still have time to invest. And if you're looking at investing, the state of Illinois is really focused on expanding its broadband throughout the state at this time. There's a lot of programs. Also, with the American Rescue Plan Act, funds that are being distributed widely to states, counties, communities, broadband is really a priority area. They really want to transform economies over the next 3 years, and so that is a place to start looking. Do your research to see what the latest and greatest information is out in the field. Many of our universities, national economic development focused agencies, and think tanks are focused on remote work, and there's a plethora of good ideas out there and new program structures being developed all the time. You're going to want to identify support structures that would be attracted to remote workers. This would be co-working spaces. People who are remote working don't want to be in their home office all the time, and they might need access to conference facilities or printers, or they just want to be out of the office, out of the home office. So look for spaces like that. Shared services. If you're a co-working space, you have a office support specialist who's there, and then you can they share secretarial services. That's something to think about. And also, once you get a certain mass of remote workers, networking opportunities. You're going to want to identify your target populations. Different communities in Illinois are going to attract different types of remote workers. So if you're you're close to a state park, you might get the more outdoorsy type. If you're close to a river, you're going to get someone who, you might get people who really want to be on the water, have boats, things like that. So you really want to know the populations you're targeting, and that also could include your own population as well. Everyone does this, but it's one thing you really want to consider is inventorying your own amenities. I think anyone who has an economic development department or a planning department, they've already done this. But this is something you're going to want to share with any of the remote workers who are looking at your community. And different types of amenities are going to be interested to different audiences, and in particular when we're talking about different generations. So there's a website called livability.com, and they do a top 100 places to live list every year, and they focused on millennials in 2021, and with the talking about remote work. And so what millennials are looking at, and I'm saying millennials because this is the group that has kids, and they're the one, and the families and their family formation, career formation, they're probably the ones that a lot of your communities are going to want to target. But what they are looking for in particular is affordability. See if they're they want to move somewhere where their paycheck goes farther. If they have kids or planning to have kids, good schools. They also want to be in an area that has maybe job opportunities or ability to help them with career exploration or career expanding their careers. And this can also be focused on remote work opportunities for them, and pulling that information together for those interested parties. One thing is interesting is incentives alone won't attract, but they can help. And some of the incentives they've talked about are rent and down payment assistance, tax breaks, cash incentives. We've seen that, I think it was in Vermont, they offered $10,000 for knowledge workers to relocate. I believe Tulsa, Oklahoma has done the same thing. But if you don't have what these people want, these remote workers want, they're not going to come no matter what your incentives. So that's just something to keep in mind. And I think Carrie touched on this in terms of depending on where they are in their job history or what they need to do based on what their company wants. Access to transportation will be important. I think we all saw that right after when the pandemic started, everyone was moving. We saw people moving to Montana, out to the mountains of Montana, or moving to places where it's very remote places, and thinking, well, this is fine, this will work for me. However, the companies now, after realizing remote work actually is a great idea, it's saving us money, but as workers, you're going to have to come into the office once or twice, a week or a month. You're going to have to be able to come to meetings in person. So you really need to be near airports, highways, Amtrak stations. So that might be something that you need to consider. They want space in their backyard and in natural areas. So they want open space. They want opportunities for civic engagement. And I know a lot of people who live in the rural areas, they really want to be part of the community. And yes, they do, because if you live in an urban or suburban area, it's amazing what you cannot do. You're not on planning committees. You're not asked to be part of Kiwanis. You're not asked to be, part of a lot of these organizations. They want to be part of your community. They also want honesty and authenticity. So what does that mean? If they're looking at rural Illinois, they know very well they're not going to be locating in a community that has a big museum, an aquarium, zoos, those types of things. They're looking at a rural community, so they know what they're looking for. They don't want you to be something that you're not. So getting back to our steps, you need to build awareness. Some of your residents already work in jobs and occupations that could be done remotely, and some of your residents would probably like to access remote work opportunities and stay in the community. So identify resources and programs for remote jobs that your current residents can access. Focus on training, digital skills training for existing students and people in your community. Remote work is not for everyone. It's really self-driven. So we have to teach a whole new generation of people that you may not go into an office. You may start your first career, your first job at home in a home office. So, and then once you've decided on this, advertise, speak directly to the remote workers and tell remote workers that you really want them there, and you are welcoming and inviting and inclusive. And I know a lot of people say, well, we already welcome people in. We kind of have a remote work strategy. We have people who are working remotely. Well, if this is going to be your economic development strategy, codify it and make sure it's something that you utilize. So to sum up this section of the presentation, your remote worker strategy is very future focused. In fact, in one webinar that I watched regarding remote work strategies, it was noted that over the coming 10 years, economic developers will have to try to attract and create tons more economic-based jobs, because the service-based jobs, those jobs that are created from serve the population, serve the businesses that are there, the retail, those types of jobs, they're being automated out. So we already talked about how ag, manufacturing, heavily automated. Well, the next round is service. So you've already been to Walmart and you have self-checkout. You've seen McDonald's, they have self-serve kiosks. So it's coming. And one thing to just keep in mind, remote working is not exotic. It is essential. It is coming whether you like it or not. So it will be better to put it under some type of management structure or economic development plan or official economic development program, and develop an intentional remote working ecosystem in your community. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cheyanne, and she's going to talk about digital workforce and inclusion strategies.
Thank you, Russell. That was very informative, and I'm glad that you guys had a nice kind of preparation there. I'm sorry, I am only so talented. I cannot share my screen and get things ready and talk at the same time. So please bear with me as I pull up this PowerPoint. All right.
Looks good.
Cool. So, as been said, my name is Cheyanne Geidman. I'm an engagement specialist with the Purdue Center for Regional Development, which is located in Indiana, so right next door to y'all. We work closely with Indiana's extension program, Purdue Extension, but we also work with many other entities, organizations, one of which is actually the Illinois Office of Broadband. I just want to give them a shout out, partially because I've been working with them closely this year, and it looks like into next year too, on their Illinois Broadband Ready program, but they have lots of great, they have studies and data and stuff on there. And so they're a great resource for you guys. I, being from Indiana, only know so much about Illinois resources, so I'm going to plug the one I know about. Anyway, Carrie and Russell did a great job of talking about remote work in terms of community development and the benefits for your community. I'm going to step back and take a little bit broader of an approach. And I'm going to spend the first half of my presentation talking about the concepts, the research, and the issues behind it so that you understand what challenges or barriers you might be facing in your community. And then we're going to talk about, okay, how is your community unique, contextualizing the solutions to fit the needs of your community. So you guys might recognize the Purdue Center for Regional Development because this lovely gentleman, Roberto Gallardo, has spoken to rural partners a couple different times. He is my boss and mentor. He's the one who got me into all this digital inclusion stuff. So some of what I say might sound familiar, and that's because he has probably talked to you about it before, but I know not everyone on this call may have had the chance to listen to him. So I am going to make sure you guys have the baseline you need to discuss this. So what is digital inclusion? The definition we commonly use around here is digital inclusion refers to the adoption of broadband technologies and its meaningful use for social and economic benefits. You could define digital inclusion in many different ways. The reason that Roberto and I are really drawn to this definition is that meaningful use for social and economic benefits. It's not just about adopting. It's not just about having good broadband. It's not just about using it. It's about how you use it and the results that come from it. So one of Roberto's famous sayings around here, he has many, but this one was even on Twitter, so I feel like it's okay for me to quote him on this, you commonly hear him say, digital exclusion is the #1 threat to 21st century community and economic development. And you'll hear us call digital exclusion the evil twin of digital inclusion. So we have this digital inclusion and we have this digital exclusion. So digital inclusion is the use and digital exclusion is not using and not benefiting. And so you have this gap, you have this divide between these two, which in research we call the digital divide. Not just in research, the digital divide has become a very popular term. You might have heard it in the news, the media. It's basically a catch-all to describe the gap between internet haves and internet have-nots. At least that was one of the original definitions. As technology has advanced and it's grown, we've kind of gone to understand it more and more. And in research, we break it down into 3 levels. Now, these levels are not necessarily independent of one another. You don't have a level 1 divide in your community or a level 3 divide, but you can have aspects of all 3. And so I kind of think of the digital divide levels as an onion, because research found them one at a time. And it's like, as we pulled back one layer, there was like, oh, there's another barrier. So we're going to talk about each of these levels, but we're going to talk about them in terms of workforce development. Now, forgive me, I'm going to broaden my scope, not just from remote work, but to workforce development in general, because there's many things that you might do to improve or target remote workers that you can also do to help skill up your current workforce, or that are applicable to other people than just remote workers. But I'll try and focus mainly on remote workers. So moving forward, let's start with this first level. So level 1 of the digital divide normally refers to access and adoption. So that's being able to, that's just the bare minimum. Can you access the internet? Do you have internet access either at home or somewhere in your community? Do you have a device so you can use that access? And are you choosing to use it? Just like any invention throughout history, any technological advancement, you have your naysayers. You have those people who are like, I don't understand why we need this. I don't know why we need dry erase boards. Chalkboards work just fine. Kids today are so spoiled. You know, there's an example all throughout history. But these mindsets affect adoption and people's choices. And so if people aren't choosing to use it, they can't get the full benefit. And so sometimes that's something you need to address in your communities. But there's a couple aspects of this first level I want to take a closer look at. Carrie and Russell already kind of touched on this infrastructure component. But one of the things I like to talk about is it's not just a quantity, it's about quality. I'm sure as people who have been in the economic development field and have gone through COVID-19, you've heard about broadband speeds. 25 megabytes download, 3 megabytes upload is the standard FCC definition of broadband. However, since COVID happened, there is mass amounts of people working from home, students learning from home, whatnot. We've seen 120 become kind of the talked about new standard. But these all can just sound like numbers unless you're some total techie person. So I wanted to kind of put these into context for you. Because 25.3 might, some people will say, oh no, that's plenty. Well, the FCC had some recommendations on what you need in order to do standard everyday things on the internet. So let's say you are watching Netflix on your computer. You need about 5 to 8 megabytes per second download. All right, that's not too bad. If you have 25.3, that should be sufficient. Or even to do your standard video call, or even have multiple people on your video call. However, the catch becomes most of us don't just have one device, and most of us don't live alone. I'm lucky enough to live alone, but I bet many of you have a spouse or children or whatnot at home. And smart home technology is becoming more popular. So think of your Alexa, your Google Dot. Those use Wi-Fi. So those are taking up your bandwidth. So 25.3 might seem sufficient until you have one kid watching Netflix while mom is on a video call and brother's playing his online game, and it all adds up quickly. And so that's where we see this 120 start coming into the conversation. And so we want to talk about not just quantity, but quality, and make sure that you are not building outdated technology. By the time your technology is in the ground and ready to go and working, if it's already outdated, you're gonna feel like you wasted money, and no one wants that. The other thing I want to say here is, here we're just talking about residential speeds. What about your businesses? If businesses don't have the bandwidth to support their workers in the office, like how are they going to think that they could possibly send their workers home to work? You also have other versions of remote workers, or people who work from home. You have entrepreneurs, you have precision agriculture and farmers who use precision agriculture to improve their yields. All of those are people who work from home who also need quality internet. So the second part that I want to talk about for the level 1 is devices. And nowadays, devices come in all shapes and sizes. You have computers, you have laptops, you have tablets, you have phones, you have smartphones. But as someone who has personally tried to write a report on a mobile phone in a place with poor connectivity, it's not fun. And sadly, there are many people who are dependent on mobile phones. And this could be for a variety of reasons. Income tends to be one of the most common factors. We see in research that lower income households are more likely to be cell phone dependent. And so that creates a barrier. Like I was just saying, it's kind of hard to write a report on a cell phone. but there's other things that may not be cell phone friendly. So your community amenities, if I have to pay my bills online or pay my parking ticket online, are those sites mobile friendly? Are your community amenities accessible online for everyone online? And we've seen this come up with schools too. Schools are making sure that kids have the devices to be able to learn from home. I have up here 2 stats for Illinois. 10.5% of Illinois households report having only a mobile device, and 11.7% of Illinois households report having no computing devices. Those come from the County Connectivity Landscape Dashboard. It's a dashboard a team in my office put together at the start of the pandemic, and it covers all the counties in the US. And it was there to help extension educators as they try to adapt their planning and their programming. But that doesn't mean you guys can't use it too. So the second level is about digital skills. So we get past, okay, you have the technology to use the internet. You have the device to access it. You want to access it. Do you have the skills to do so? And this becomes even more important with remote work, as we're seeing more and more jobs requiring certain more and more jobs requiring certain digital skills. Let's dig into that a little more. Researchers for years have tried to develop a framework to measure digital skills, and there's so many different ways to measure digital skills. But I threw some examples up here from a couple different frameworks because there's a theme here. As you read through them, it's about navigating the internet, knowing how to use an internet browser, knowing how to use a search engine, being able to navigate a website, not getting lost in cyberspace, being able to interpret information online and decide its validity. Those are all, some might call those basic digital skills, but they're also transferable. If you know how to use one website, then hopefully you know how to use another one. So this becomes a question of quality of workers. For example, your company is instituting new software. If your workers don't know how to use just the basic internet, it's going to be 10 times harder. And that's just a number I made up. It might be more, it might be less, but it's going to be even harder for them to learn this new software if they've had no experience with any digital software ever before. So the more of these basic transferable skills, the more we kind of learn to speak this digital language, it becomes easier to collect these digital skills almost as if they were Pokemon. But then we get into remote work and you have occupation-specific skills. These are just a few that came to mind for me when I was thinking, okay, as a remote worker, what skills do I need to be able to do my job effectively? We make fun a lot online about Zoom etiquette and video conferencing and the do's and don'ts, and there's social norms all around that. And for people who are getting on Zoom for the first time or whatnot, they don't know that etiquette. I have a weekly session with some friends online, and you can tell 2 of us are remote workers and we live on Zoom. So there's things we do that the rest of them don't. And it's really interesting to watch that. So you need to ask, is your workforce prepared to be remote workers? Do they have the skills necessary to be remote workers? And how can you help them build those skills? And it's not just your remote workers. Do businesses in your area does their leadership have the skills to manage remote workers? So as you look at increasing remote work, you want to make sure that there are the skills in place to do that. All right, so the third level of the digital divide is digital capital and offline benefits. I'm gonna breeze through this kind of fast because this is still a fairly new, this is fairly abstract and new, and it can be kind of hard to wrap your mind around. But I want to talk a bit about digital capital. Hopefully, some of you at some point have heard about community capitals. I know Extension loves to talk about community capitals, at least they do in Indiana. But we've added digital capital to that community capitals framework. And so being able to garner this digital capital online. But it's also important that you're able to, that you, need to breathe and talk slower. Carrie and Russell did a great job of talking about using your community amenities to attract remote workers. You want to also look at how you can use these digital technologies to enhance or to further the offline benefits that your residents receive in these community capitals. And also think of developing the skills of your remote workers and your workforce. That's a form of improving your human capital. So there's many different ways to approach this, but those are just a few. All right. Now I'm going to get on my soapbox in case you guys have not heard me talk enough and talk about contextualization. This is something I'm very passionate about. Too often, we will try and do cookie cutter approaches to anything from education to, I don't know, but every community is different. Yes, I've talked about, and I will continue to talk about trends or commonalities that we see, but the people who make up a community are different for every community, and so every community is unique, and they have unique skills. And so what you need to do, how the gaps appear, how the digital divide appears, how it affects your community is going to be different for everyone. And that means you're going to require different solutions, or you're going to have to customize your solutions and your strategies to fit your community. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time today talking about some of these different ways your community might be different from your neighboring community. And moving forward. Before I do that, I do see in here a question: where can people get those digital skills and learn digital etiquette? It's a great question. That can be one of your strategies. I've seen that worked into digital inclusion plans or digital divide elimination plans, that they will develop such programming. Libraries become a common source for such workshops, especially when it comes to digital skills. We always want to make sure that schools nowadays, most of them do have digital skills training courses, but you want to make sure that is part of your standard education. But yeah, there is no set answer to that. And that's oftentimes something that communities need to build. All right. All right, so let's talk about digital immigrants, digital natives, and digital fluency. So one of the concepts that's been popping up in research is this idea of digital immigrants and digital natives. So digital natives is a term used to refer to those people who grew up with technology, who experienced technology from a very young age, whereas digital immigrants are people who encounter technology later in life. So I think of it almost like learning a new language. When you learn a new language from a young age and you're constantly working on it from a young age, then it becomes almost second nature. Whereas if you try and learn it later in life, you can do it and you can become just as fluent as a native speaker, but it might be a little bit harder, or you'll have different challenges. Now, I have this timeline up here because I wanted to make a point that not all digital natives are equal. People who grew up in the 90s or who were teenagers in the 90s versus teenagers in later years, the internet looked vastly different. And so they had vastly different experiences online. And so we can't assume just by age how fluent someone is. And there's also other things that can impact, how much exposure they had to technology as a child. Was it taught in schools? Just because they're young doesn't mean that they're a digital native. And so there's different levels of digital fluency. But you'll want to take a step back and ask, do you have digital immigrants in your community or digital natives? And what unique needs do they have? Or what unique skills do they have that you can capitalize on? If you have some very influential TikTokers in your community, take advantage of that and get them to be ambassadors for your community and hype them up on TikTok. These 4 socioeconomic indicators I have on my slide here, research has shown to be a predictor for adoption. So people who are older, less educated, have lower income, or have some sort of disability are less likely to choose to adopt. So as you're talking about skilling up your workforce or making sure that your residents can be remote workers or attracting remote workers, keep in mind these socioeconomic barriers because these groups might need more attention, they might need require different strategies and have different barriers than other groups. For example, income. It does no good to build infrastructure if people can't afford it. There's often this mindset that build it and they will come, or there's that saying, but you can build it, but if they can't buy it. So you want to make sure that things are affordable and accessible in multiple ways. Community resources. I'm going to fly past this because Carrie and Russell touched on this already, but as someone who's worked with the Extension Disaster Education Network, I think of the worst case scenario. If there's a disaster, if a squirrel gets shocked on my power line and I lose electricity for a couple days, if my internet goes out, I'm late paying my bills, and so I'm without internet for a couple days, where can I go to continue remote working? How can I keep that continuity? What resources are available? Co-working spaces like Carrie and Russell talked about, great options. Public libraries also tend to be a huge asset. Many communities will map out public Wi-Fi hotspots and have those posted online so that people can find those more easily. You may also want to think about where people can go for IT help and support. Are there organizations in your community where they can ask questions and get help, or even businesses that can do that, fill that gap? All right. I recognize that I am running up close on time, so I'm going to breeze through these final slides. They're kind of academic, they're kind of research heavy. This one, I just had planned to talk about how not everyone has the option to remote work. Pew Research did a study to see, who are remote workers. And Roberto and a colleague did a study to see at the beginning of the pandemic if counties were able to remote work, and they looked at occupations. So were there occupations in that county that were remote workable, that could remote work, and do they have the infrastructure in that county to support them? And so they had found that remote work was going to be better positioned in more urban, larger economies, more educated workers, and higher income counties. Here in Indiana, now I know this is I know you guys are Illinois, not Indiana, but it's something we can learn from our neighbors. PCRD worked with a couple organizations over here to do a survey of employers in Indiana and ask them questions related to remote work. And some of the major takeaways from that is It's not just your workers you have to look at when you're talking about remote work strategies for economic development, it's also your businesses. Some of them may not understand the benefits of remote work and what it could do for their business, how it could save them money, help attract better talent, those sorts of things. Some lack the tools or the infrastructure necessary to do that, not just infrastructure as in broadband access, but as in the policies, the training, knowing how to manage people remotely, those sorts of things. So if you have organizations or employers in your community right now who have remote workers, they may not be keeping those people as remote workers. And so I highly encourage you to talk to those employers and find out what those needs are, not just with these and with things like digital skills, because I can sit here all day and tell you which digital skills I think workers should have, but at the end of the day, I'm not hiring them. They are, so you need to meet their needs. Carrie and Russell also touched on automation. I threw the slide in here because I just thought it was really cool. They blew my mind when they did this study. But automation is something that's going to impact and change our workforce. And COVID-19 might cause some occupations to become automated. And so in this study, some of my colleagues had looked at the risk of automation for an occupation and how much exposure risk they had to COVID-19. And so we're trying to see, okay, what occupations might be more at risk for automation. And so as we talk about not just remote workers, but skilling up workers, these might be populations to target. And then I'm a huge advocate for public libraries. Working for a university, we try and stay agnostic and neutral, but I will beat the drum for public libraries all day long. They do so much, and the more I work on digital inclusion plans and digital divide elimination plans, the more I find public libraries are stepping up and doing things like hotspot lending programs. You can not only check out a book, but you can check out a whole laptop or a whole little hotspot. It's amazing. So they're a great resource. Most communities have some sort of public library, so talk to them. They are also a great source for getting your finger on what's happening in the community. So summary, what can you do? Wrapping it up, get to know your community through available data, listen to people, talk to residents, talk to businesses. What are their needs? Find out what they're seeing, what challenges they're facing, and look at how to address those. Look at your online community. Is it accessible, accurate, positive? No one wants to move to your community if all the reviews online are negative. And get people together to discuss projects and programs. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten people together to write a digital inclusion plan, and they spend the whole meeting talking about what each individual organization is doing. And we walk away and half of them are like, oh, hey, can I talk to you? We should partner on this. And those connections are invaluable. And making a plan can help you leverage future funding opportunities as they come. Yeah. So that is the end of my slides. I am looking at the chat box for questions. What do you do in a rural area without a library? That's a great question. And this is actually something, I grew up in a county where not the full county was covered by the library. And so I had friends who did not have library cards because they were outside the library district. And I've brought this up in counties before, and they're like, that was such a foreign concept to them. So I think a lot of times we take our public libraries for granted and we don't realize that there are rural areas that don't have an access to a library. And so that might be where a co-working space might fill that gap, or a maker space or something similar. Churches are also,
Cheyanne, also a lot of the smaller cafes, coffee shops, restaurants in rural communities may have broadband as a something where people can go and use instead of a co-working space.
yeah, and churches, especially in those rural areas, tend to step up there a lot.
Well, and we have a lot of great comments in the chat box, people congratulating the presenters on great information that they presented today. I had put a poll up. We got those results back from that poll. I'm gonna stick another poll question up for participants to answer while we take some more questions. But there was one comment in the chat about using your local library card for any public library in Illinois. Could any of you speak to that as a viable strategy?
As an Indiana native, I cannot speak to that. I don't know if Carrie or Russ will know anything about it.
Could you restate that question, Nancy? I was a little.
Using your local library card for any library in Illinois, is that something?
It used to be. I grew up in Knoxville, and we were able to use our library cards in Galesburg. So I do believe that still exists. And even more importantly, you can probably use interlibrary lending if there's data that you want. But I know there's a lot of rural libraries out there. One of the counties that I serve, Henderson County, has a fabulous rural library. It's only in one of the communities, but they do mobile access. So a lot of the rural counties do have some libraries and usually serve the entire county as well.
I'm getting the message that my mic may be spotty, so I apologize for that. I don't see any other questions at this time. However, I'm wondering if the presenters have any sort of lasting takeaways that they want to leave with participants, or maybe can speak to if you're just getting started on being able to accommodate remote workers in your community. What's sort of some of those first steps?
Well, I will say that I think everyone thinks that this remote work is something we have to do right now. We have to capture the population that's on the move right now. But I want people to understand. I think it's more of a long term. It's a structural change in the economy. So if you're looking at your community and say, oh gosh, we don't have broadband access, or it's not very good, or we are planning to do this expansion, keep working on it. It does not mean this won't be something that you can do. And in fact, I think it's going to be essential that you do it eventually pull it together as an economic development strategy for your rural community.
The other thing to note is that you probably already have a segment of your population who is remote working and who plans on continuing remote working. So finding out who they are and what their needs are. And we're not just talking about people who work for a company. There are a lot of people who have done some entrepreneurial things. You hear about people starting their own Etsy shops, those kinds of things. Those are remote workers. And, they are going to be growing. And as our retail environment shifts and the service industry shifts, those are other things that you might want to take a look at and find out where those people are communicating, gathering, supporting each other, because they're already out there. So really trying to get a handle on who they are right now and thinking about what your community has to offer as a attraction. You know, we talk about, I live in Galesburg. We're on an interstate. We have Amtrak 4 times a day to Chicago. So that's a pretty good amenity to have if you're trying to attract remote workers. But those of you if you're in Southern Illinois, you have a beautiful natural environment around you. Those are things that might attract a certain kind of population. So thinking about who would like to go hiking at Giant City on a regular basis, those kinds of things, really trying to think about what those big draws might be in your areas. And as oh, go ahead, Cheyanne.
Sorry, I was going to say, while we're thinking about remote work as a long-term strategy, our students who are in school right now who are doing e-learning, they're essentially learning how to be remote workers or being remote learners. And so how can we make sure that the skills we are helping them develop now will benefit them in the workforce?
I really thank you, all 3 of you, for your presentations today. I want to thank everybody for being on the call. I just want everyone to know that you will be receiving a follow-up email today with a recording of today's webinars and a link to the slides. Thank you for your participation, and thanks for your interest in Illinois Extension programs.